the ideas and the research pattern that led me to write this book. Just to be, I'm not going into all the details of the story of the book. If you're interested, you can read it. It's here in the library. But what I'm going to do is to try and give you an idea of the research questions, the concepts, and the methodologies, and how I thought this story in a faraway past and in a faraway place was relevant to understand nowadays water development projects and water development problems at a global scale. So very ambitious project, you can say. Okay, so first of all, this is an environmental history book. So let me tell you something very briefly of what environmental history is. It is the study of the evolution of society-nature relationships through time. This is a very general definition. What environmental historians do? Basically, they do empirical research, most of all, about places, and they examine written testimonies, because of course we're talking about the past, but they also examine environmental data where they are available. For example, data about land and water degradation, climate change, or about seawater level, any kind of environmental data that might be available from the past. And they crisscross this social data and environmental data with when possible, with oral sources. When we're talking about a more recent past, let's say in the last 50 years, we can also use oral sources to have, and of course that would be the best to do, to have common people perceptions of environmental change, the people that normally do not have access to the production of written sources. What else? Environmental historians normally intersect different scales of analysis, the local with the national and with the international. And for example, in the book, I look at this Liri Valley, the small river valley in the central Apennines of southern Italy, but with an eye on the connections between this particular place, the landscape and its transformations, and the big history. No? For example, the Industrial Revolution, a big historical process that was taking place in the same period, in that period. The French Revolution, and I will tell you why, because the French arrived with the Napoleonic Empire. They arrived in the Liri Valley, and they brought, oh my son, I'm sorry, this is my son. I'm very sorry about that. So the French brought their ideas about nature, their legal system, their economic system, so they influenced this place. Environmental history also look at the intersection between the urban and the rural scale of analysis, and the long term, very long term, with the événementiel, the short term. For example, we crisscross the perspective of the Brodelian, the three Brodelian levels of analysis: the long duration, the short term, and the medium term. In the end, what is all this for? What's the scope? What's the aim? The aim, in my view, is to produce a counter-narrative of Western development. A counter-narrative environmental history is a strongly alternative vision of historical development. And because it assumes the perspective of the environmental and social costs in general. In my case, environmental and social costs of industrialization. And it's a reflection on how these two are related to each other. Environmental costs are also social costs. And environmental change is strictly related to social change. So this is basically the aim of the environmental history approach. again, something about the narrative of Western development, because this is, I think, this is a very important point. As environmental historian Carolyn Merchant says, we are the result of the stories we have been told, and those that we have accepted as true. And one of these stories, one of the most accepted and one of the most powerful narratives of Western development is the story of the so-called modern economic growth. And what's that? It's the story of how the Western world got rich, to tell it in simple terms, got rich in the last 200 years after the Industrial Revolution, and how this wealth of the Western world was spread to humanity, was brought around the world, and today it became a global phenomenon affecting the whole world, so that all societies, by imitating the West, can get rich and can be on the same pattern. This is a very powerful and very mainstream narrative. I come from economic history, my PhD. So I've heard this story told again and again in a very acritical way in all in the economic history mainstream. So when I set up to write this book, I had this sort of intention of deconstructing this narrative and proving it wrong. So that's also one of the scopes of the book. What is the book about? It is an environmental history of the Industrial Revolution in a Mediterranean valley, and we'll see how the Mediterranean is important, because the place is important. Its climate, for example, its water regime, the kind of water regime that we have in each different place that are not the same everywhere. Mediterranean rivers are very torrential and unpredictable water flows, and this has consequences on the way they can be used and they can be dealt with. Or the general topic, we could say, is water appropriation in the age of industry. The methodology is interdisciplinary, long-term, and above all, it's place-based. The research question that originated this book is the contradiction between property and flow. What originated the research question was how did this appropriation of water that took place in the Liri Valley contradict the very nature of water, which is a flowing object, which is, for its physical and ecological characteristics, is not for a stock, it's not a form of accumulable capital, and it has its own dynamics that relate to the ecosystem and relate to climate and relate to the local society and the way the local community and the way this community approached the river. So how did these two things, property rights and the flow of water, contradict each other? That was what originated this research. And the scope was to frame the genesis, to look at a faraway transformation that, in my view, can be used to understand the genesis of two major problems of today's water development projects. And the first one is the issue of water scarcity. That is the unequal distribution of water access. Water scarcity is not absolute, it's relative, it is produced, it's socially produced. And it's also a result of certain types of technologies and certain types of legal systems. And second one is water vulnerability. So the unequal distribution of water risk. Water risk, of course, is not produced directly by society, but the vulnerability is. So the unequal exposure of different social groups and different localities to water risk. Am I going too fast, or is everything? I mean, if you have any doubts or questions, please just raise your hands. Okay. Okay, so the intent of the book was to shed light on those two big issues by looking at transformations in the landscape of a particular river valley and how these affected human life in the local community. So the landscape of revolution, by revolution here I mean the Industrial Revolution, and how this embodied in the local place and transformed the local landscape and transformed the people's lives. Okay? It's not just the Industrial Revolution, but it's the entire age of revolution that is embodied in the local landscape. And by age of revolution, I refer here to historian Eric Hobsbawm, who talks about this period of European history as a crucial one for the shaping of the modern world, because this is the period that goes from the Enlightenment as a philosophy, but also enlightened absolutism of European states, through the French Revolution, spread all over Europe through the French Empire, the Napoleonic Empire, and the Industrial Revolution that took all these things took place more or less in the course of 50 years, and they changed the face of Europe forever. And the advent of political economy, Adam Smith's and the early political economies were all in the same period. And at the same time, the advent of industrial capitalism. That was not the first form of capitalistic economy, but it was probably the one with the greatest impact in social terms and in environmental terms. It was the industrialization of the mode of production. So all these things manifested themselves in the changes in the landscape of the Lehigh Valley. But at the same time, the reflection is also that places, in turn, they shape history. They contribute to make history in an active way, not because they have agency, of course, but because they have characteristics that influence the way things go. For example, industrial capitalism, that this was a basic reflection I did in the book, was born and raised in river valleys, in the river valleys of Europe and North America. This is a fact that is widely recognized even in the historical mainstream, that the first factory systems, the first factories, the first industrial districts, they were all located in river valleys because water was the energy that the factories used to move their engines. And as industrialization consisted in the mechanization of production, the shift from manual domestic production to mechanical and concentrated factory production, a source of energy was needed. Energy was very important. The availability of good and cheap energy was very important, was essential. And the first engines were not steam engines, they were water-powered engines. And also the first machines of the Industrial Revolution, like for example the arkwright machine, the textiles, was water-powered. So this went on for decades. Of course, in England, this may be true for a little period, because then England soon enough found out they had so much coke they could move to the steam engine and to a different kind of industrialization. But as regards other countries, European countries like, for example, France or Italy or even Central European countries, they continued to use water as a form of energy for a long time. And North America, US industrialization was entirely water-based. So American historians describe this in a lot of interesting essays. But what can we? Why is this important? Why do we care? Because I believe that we have to look at this process as something that influenced the shaping of this early industrial capitalism. So who were these first industrialists? Basically, they were the masters of water. Karl Marx, for example, talks about that. He describes, in the third volume, I think, of Capital, he describes this group of people that he calls the owners of the waterfalls as people that, and so the early industrialists who use water as a sort of monopoly rent, because they are those who have exclusive access to that source of energy and nobody else can. So the first industrialists, actually, in Marx's description, are monopoly rentiers, and that's very interesting. If you think about all the liberal ideology. So water appropriation was a fundamental exercise in capital accumulation. So appropriating water as a source of energy was the first basic and most important task for this new social class. And then, of course, here it comes again the flow versus stock ecological contradiction of capitalism, because appropriating water was something, was not like appropriating land or any other material asset, and it generated a series of consequences that I will tell you about. Okay, so something more about theory. The theory I use to understand this historical process. From a theoretical point of view, I rely much on the political ecology. I don't know if you have ever heard about it. This is an approach, a theoretical approach that stems from the interaction between all these social theories. First of all, eco-Marxism. It is based on studies by, for example, James O'Connor, or Ted Benton, or John Bellamy Foster, sociologists who have reread Marx in looking for Marx's ideas about nature. And they have elaborated a theory of how Marxism can be reread in an ecological, contributed in its own way to an ecological critique of capitalism. The central idea of eco-Marxism is what James O'Connor calls the second contradiction of capitalism. That is the contradiction between capital and nature. First one is between capital and labor, of course. And so I use that idea, I applied that idea at the contradiction of property versus flow in the case of water. Then, of course, word system theory, referring to the work of Immanuel Wallerstein, and the idea that capitalism was actually born in the global capitalistic world system was born in the 15th century as a consequence of European expansion worldwide, etc. And basically it's the idea that what happens in a single place like the Lille Valley, apparently out of reach, is actually strongly influenced by global processes, global phenomenon of political economy nature, political economic nature. And then there is a injection of Polanyi in all this, and basically I will talk more about Polanyi later. I assume you all know his work, and of Foucault, especially the governmentality part, which has been re-elaborated into political ecology as a concept of environmentality. So it's in the application of Foucauldian approach to environmental politics. And then there's cultural geography, especially Lefebvre and the British geographer David Harvey, that some of you might have heard about, who again reinterpret Marxist thought, but also elaborate concepts such as, for example, spatial justice or environmental justice. And then I added to all this, I added my own favorite economist, Carl William Kapp. This was a non-orthodox economist of the period between the wars and soon after World War II. He did his own interpretation of the concept of social costs, and he wrote this book, this wonderful book that I recommend to everybody, which is called The Social Costs of Private Enterprise, first published in 1950 and then republished in 1970 and translated also in various languages. But he was not an academic he was not a mainstream scholar, but not even a real academic. He came to academia very late in life, and he was very controversial because he developed these ideas at the same time as neoclassical economics was triumphing everywhere, and so his approach was particularly non-orthodox. Okay, so the book is particularly concerned with this property and flow contradiction. So, property law is seen as a fundamental dispositive of legitimization of water appropriation in the name of progress. And I see this through what happens in the Liri Valley. And the state, of course, is the guarantor of water property. What happens in the Liri Valley is that in 1806, the French Empire, the Napoleonic Empire, arrives to southern Italy and rules the country for 10 years. In those 10 years, everything is changed. The Neapolitan society, we're talking here about southern Italy, so before the unification of the country, we're talking here about the former kingdom of Naples, basically southern Italy. It was a feudal he had a feudal legal system. So the arrival of the Napoleonic Empire brought in the country the defeudalization of the legal system, the Napoleonic Code, and as regards water, this meant that all water resources were defeudalized. They shifted from the feudal system to the public.
Excuse me, the very boring thing, but Napoleonic Code is 1804, actually.
Yeah, I know. Sorry, that's the year it came to southern Italy.
I know that it was that, but I just for the
Of course, sorry about that. Okay. Sorry about that. That's this for the the Neapolitan perspective.
Yeah.
That's the year when it came to be applied.
Sure.
And so there was a shift from the feudal society. The water shifted from the feudal regime to public regime. But that's very interesting. What did public mean? What did the Napoleonic Code do? It was to reintroduce Roman water law that had been abolished during the feudal period and also in the feudal legal regime. The water were in the hands of the baronial control, seigneurial regime. So they were not res nullius, they were not public, the rivers were not public, they belonged to the crown, and the crown had entrusted them to the feudatories. Okay? So at this point, what the Napoleonic Code did was to say, okay, all rivers are now public. So public meant that they were open to all. Okay? So everybody could access water and use the river for any economic purpose. But what's interesting about this is that automatically, since this coincided with the age of industrialization, not all users of water had the same status, same social status. There were some users of water that were considered of public interest, and some that were considered less important. And the ones who came to be considered of public interest were, of course, those related to industrialization. So, in practice, what happened was the effect of the law was to make it possible individual appropriation of rivers in the name of the public good, the general interest of the nation. And this, of course, generated a lot of water litigation, because being water also a land-based resource, appropriating a river means that people get to fight each other for access, for physical access to the river, and the process of enclosure was also a material process in which industrialists tried by any means to appropriate certain tracts of the river. So this caused a lot of litigation and also an environmental impact, of course, on the river course. Then this was maintained after the French went. This code, this approach was maintained by the state, the Bourbon state. And so water litigation went on and on for many decades until in 1865 the Savoy here arrived to southern Italy, and the country was unified into a nation, the Italian nation. And so a new code of law was applied, the new Italian public law published in 1865. Through which the water became, from public, that became very more specific, state property. So, where public, in the first period, public meant res nullius, it meant open to all, and de facto opened up to appropriation, individual appropriation. In the second period, the juridical status of water came to be state property. So, in practice, this was the rule of law, but what did in practice happen on the ground, in the places? What happened was that, of course, all water users, all industrialists kept the water they were using to move their factories, only now they had to ask for a concession. So the Institute of Concession, water concession, was created, and the state had to regulate all these individual concessions through water disciplinaries. I mean, we have a word in Italian is disciplinare, which is translatable as, I think, water discipline, regulation. But discipline is more interesting because it's the idea. I found it very funny. Yeah, exactly. This idea that the state could discipline water and water users, of course, that were always. In practice, this was very difficult to implement because industrialists opposed a strong resistance. They were used to think of water as their private property. They didn't want to pay for it. They didn't want to be regulated. They didn't want to be disciplined. And so they opposed any kind of resistance they could. And what came out of all this was tacit consent on the part of the state to the status quo. So industrialists kept their water properties, and even the law recognized these, the ones existing for the preceding 30 years, so that of course facilitated things in a way that nothing really changed. And this went on for a while. Then what put an end to all this was not that much the law as technology. At one point, at the end of the 19th century, the water power was not so important anymore because a new technology, not the steam engine, because in Italy we didn't have much coal, so steam engine was very expensive. But the new technology was hydropower, electricity, hydroelectricity, and that changed everything because I can't now explain that, but if you're interested, I'll go on that later. Okay, so what's the next step? The next step is that to sustain the property, the legal system, the law, water law I have described, it needed to be sustained by a particular culture, a particular set of assumptions. As legal systems are always a product of cultural assumptions as they intersect with power relationships. So, and here let me open a little parenthesis. I quoted above a lot of social scientists and theories that help me to make sense of this story. But to tell you the truth, if I had to quote the one that was the single one that was really very inspirational to my book, that would be a British literary critic, Raymond Williams, who wrote a wonderful essay in 1980 called Ideas of Nature. A small essay, very easy to read.
Is it a book or an article?
No, it's a book chapter. It's in the book. It's called Essays in Materialism and Culture. Ideas of Nature. What did he say? He explains in the chapter. He explains the dialectical relation that is created between ideas of nature and social relationships. And he explains two things that normally you don't think as related that much, no? And he explains how the way societies see nature and the ideas they develop about nature are at the same time ideas about society and how society and how social relationships should be organized based on the use of natural resources. So it sounds like a complicated concept, but it is very clear and very easy to read. So I suggest to read the essay. But this was very inspirational for me to understand, in my case, how the enclosure process, the enclosure of water, were related to a particular cultural assumptions, and in particular the mechanicism, the idea of nature elaborated through mechanistic science since the scientific revolution on the one side, and on the other side to individualism, the political theory of individualism, and how these three processes are strictly interconnected with each other and influence each other in a way to transform what the medieval and late modern European culture considered nature as the organic vision of nature as a whole, including all relationships between living things and non-living things, and including spirits and deities and the non-material world. All this was replaced with the scientific revolution, was replaced by a mechanistic vision of nature. This is explained very well in Carolyn Merchant's book, The Death of Nature. the way Western culture transformed, killed Mother Nature and transformed it into dead inert matter composed of atoms, of individual particles that could be abstracted, separated from the whole, and so appropriated and transformed, re-engineered and transformed into something else. And this is a very important basic assumption that we don't normally think about it, because it's part of our own culture, it's part of the way we see the world. But it's important to understand that this was a process that was a transformation, ideal transformation, that took place at one point of European history, and it was not like that before. So the result of this relationship between mechanicism with, of course, the political theory of individualism and the enclosure process, and the transformation was the transformation of nature into a bundle of individual natural resources, so awaiting to be appropriated and improved. The word they used at the time was not development that much. That's a very later word. It was invented that much later. They used the word improvement. So what is improvement? Is the idea that nature as it is not good for social purpose. It has to be improved. So it has to be re-engineered, it has to be socially re-engineered, so taken from the common, and it has been technically re-engineered, so transformed. And for example, so the improvement, what I call the improvement project, that was a real social phenomenon taking place all over Europe in the second half of the 18th century and the whole 19th century, was based on the new dispositives, to use a Foucauldian term, of socio-environmental control. The two very important ones: private property, the institution of private property, and the state as the grantor of productive rights, and also as an entrepreneur itself, because many European states put up improvement schemes and transformed the European landscape in an important way. And as regards water, the improvement project took the form of water development schemes, in particular land drainage, so moors and fence and wetlands were drained all over Europe, and transformed. This land was transformed into productive agricultural land, and all this drainage, in all this drainage process, a lot of water was of course re-engineered through river channeling. That is the other very important aspect of the improvement schemes, water improvement schemes in this period of European history. And be aware that this approach to water was later exported everywhere Europeans went in the colonies. They applied this same scheme. So land had to be drained, rivers had to be channeled. No more meandering rivers. We don't want those. They're undisciplined. We want straight channels. Okay? Because straight channels are usable for navigation, for water power, for industry, for everything. And of course, water power. Rivers came to be seen as potentially potential energy usable for social needs. So this approach to water was later exported in the colonies, and it became the bulk upon which water development projects were built everywhere in different ecological conditions, in different climate conditions, in different social conditions. So this is part of the westernization of the world. It had an environmental dimension, very important environmental dimension. Well, so of course this process of water improvement had its own costs. Okay, so it's what I call the tragedy of enclosure, responding to the better known tragedy of the commons by Garrett Harding. A theory that, strange as it sounds, because it was formulated in a very short article like 40 years ago, still makes people talk, and it's still pretty much mainstream, even though it has been heavily criticized, and in particular, as you know, by the Common Property Studies group, referring, for example, to Elinor Ostrom, Nobel Prize in Economics last year, that have heavily criticized the tragedy of the commons theory. Their criticism is based on the first point. The commons were not, as Harding describes them, as open to all and anarchic, but actually they were community owned, and they were very strictly regulated. So, so they criticize the theory from its assumption for being ahistorical, for not looking at the way things actually were. But there is a second kind of criticism that can be raised against Harding, and that's what I try to do in the book, is that enclosures and the privatization or state control of water also cause environmental degradation and inequality, environmental inequality. This is an argument that paradoxically has not been employed that much in the critiques of Harding. And so, but it is very clear, for example, in the case study I examined. And as a way to picture this process of environmental degradation and environmental inequality, we can use Polanyi's expression of improvement versus habitation. In, I think it's first chapter in The Great Transformation, when he describes the English enclosures. He talks, the chapter title is Improvement versus Habitation, meaning that the improvement project in the project of re-engineering nature went against habitation. And what's that? Habitation is a sort of archaic word that he uses to describe the relationship between local communities and their land, their environment, and the way local people used the land. The way local communities accessed natural resources and made their subsistence out of them. So that's habitation, the way people lived and worked on the land, on their place, in their place. And how he describes how the improvement project goes against habitation. And for example, massive displacement of people from out of their villages, out of their lands, towards the cities or towards other places or towards the working houses, and the proletarization, the process of proletarization, etc. In the Lehigh Valley case, we can describe the social costs of water enclosure in three processes. The first was water litigation, and of course the rising of transaction costs as industrialists had. I mean, the process of appropriation was not peaceful, no? It was not pacific. Then we have the loss of access to water for the subsistence, for example, fisheries, for recreation, for health purposes. So the loss of access by common people to their water. And third aspect is the increase of water risk, because all these enclosures actually increased the risk of flooding, and that was very evident in the Lehigh Valley. It was a relatively healthy place before industrialization, and it became completely struck by flooding, by recurrent floods during the whole 19th century. The whole period of industrialization was a period of floods. And of course, pollution, water pollution, so also water not being safe anymore, neither for aquatic life, for fish, neither for humans, and water scarcity, because of course the enclosure of the river meant that common people had no access to water anymore, so they had to take it from somewhere else. Finally, I'm concluding. Just to make some very quick global comparisons of the same phenomenon of water enclosures as it was exported and as it happened in various places of the world, starting from the 19th century to today. And from what environmental historians have described, we can see these four typologies: the urban industrial watershed, that's what more or less what the one I've described, but the ones from Northern Europe and North America. Where big rivers, but also flatlands, mostly flatlands, and this re-engineering of water of the rivers through the industrial districts and cities, etc. And the kind of social water, for example, the channelization of the rivers for transportation. Then we have the Mediterranean watershed, and that's more the story I tell in the book. The Mediterranean watershed is a different story, because Mediterranean rivers are more like torrents. They're not big rivers, they're not flat, they are torrential, they are much more subjected to flooding and to land degradation. They live in a very precarious equilibrium between connecting uphill mountains and lands in a very precarious way. So industrializing those watersheds had a huge environmental impact in terms of risk, of hydrological risk. Then we have the colonial watershed, very well described, for example, the Nile or the Orissa Basin. There's books about these places and how the Europeans imposed their own vision of how water had to be used, destroying the local water uses that were much more sustainable, actually, and creating both water scarcity and water risk. And the post-colonial watershed that is of today due to World Bank development projects or state development projects, like, for example, the Belo Monte Dam in Brazil, a huge project that is destroying thousands of local indigenous communities and their relationship to the land, and it's also having a huge environmental impact. All these have in common, in my view, this contradiction of improvement versus habitation that Polanyi described, the superimposing of the state logic and capital logic over the logic of local communities and their subsistence and their relationship with the land. Conclusions? Well, first, very quickly. First conclusion is a critique of the community commons myth. Okay, we have to be aware that communities are not paradise. They are ridden by power relations, social discrimination, and oppression against minority groups, for example, or against women, or whatever. Parochialism, communities versus communities. And they are also ridden by violence and conflict, and they have very often forms of monopoly rent within the community. So, I mean, it doesn't mean that local resources are equally distributed, etc. So, what I suggest in the conclusion is not looking back but looking forward towards a reinvention of the commons, a reinvention of water commons in particular, in two ways. One is deconstructing the development narrative that I told you before, and the other is trying to build a more inclusive idea of community, including social ecological interconnections, and for example, including the non-human world as part of the common. Thank you. For being here in this end of term and for listening to maybe a very long talk.
Questions?
Do you have questions?
So I have a couple of remarks, if I may, before, if you are ready to take some questions.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm not sure that I was probably more happy if you didn't have the last conclusion slide.
Yes, I thought it would be controversial.
Yeah. So, but I would like to leave that to a further. Now I have two questions about your presentation that were was very interesting, very well structured. Thank you very much. It was very good. You made two en passant remarks that I spotted, and that sometimes are those that actually one should discuss more than those that are actually thought. And these were, you said at some point, water is not like land. Like assuming that land could be naturally enclosable, as opposed to water that actually has some natural reason not to be enclosable, the flow in the thing. And that is something I would really like to discuss a little bit with you, because clearly, if we challenge as we do, and you do, certainly the opposition between nature and culture, it's difficult to find like some sort of an ontology of water as opposed to the ontology of land as far as the enclosure goes. Right? They are both highly socially constructed ideas. And I would like to listen to you a little more about that, whether you think that there is something in water that is making it a common more than a common would be land. It still produces food and other kind of stuff like that. Okay, that's one point. And then you said another thing that they found even more, actually you said it before, but which is something that to me needs to have some elaboration. You said places, of course, do not have agency. Okay, when you were talking about places, and about how places shape. Yeah, so you kind of excluded the idea that a place can have agency, and so you kind of again fall into the idea that there is such a thing as a place outside of its inhabitants, or something like a cryptically objectified idea of a place. Which again, if we look at things from the perspective of the commons, it's a remark that is either wrong or needs to be elaborated quite a bit. And so this is my kind of commons obsessed perspective of this, because I kind of have the sense that if we look at things from the perspective of the commons, we really need to have a special caution into rejecting, the kind of mechanicized positivistic assumptions that are the narrative that has, in which we grew up. We all grew up into a narrative, as you said from the beginning, and this is leaving traces very deep into us that we need to kind of challenge whenever we spot them. So I would like you to give us a few remarks on that. Thanks.
Well, thank you. Those are very insightful comments, and I see how they might have been raised by the way I put things. But I just want to clarify my position, which is very consonant to yours in the first case. That is the water-land dichotomy. I don't see any water-land dichotomy. That was maybe an unhappy way to put it. What I wanted to emphasize ontologically, okay? What I wanted to emphasize is that ecologically there are differences, and every has to say that nature matters. If we want to understand socio-ecological relationships, we have to consider society, but we also have to look at nature, how it works, and how ecosystems are structured, and how what's their life, the life of an ecosystem. Okay, so that's what I'm not a scientist. I'm not a natural scientist, but I did try to learn about river hydrology, for example, or river basin ecological connections. And so I learned, I understood that there are some particular characteristics about water, about rivers in particular. Let's not talk about water in general, because lakes are already something different. Okay, so each ecosystem and each ecological environment and each each aspect of within an ecosystem has its own characteristics that are important and have to be taken into the account. So what I wanted to suggest is that the application of the property idea to the river had some consequences, a kind of environmental impact that was different from the environmental impact of property over land. That was my point. Not that property over land is naturally applicable with no environmental consequence, but that the environmental consequences are different. And in the case of flowing, in the case of fresh water or rivers, the environmental consequences I tried to describe are those of, for example, the loss of aquatic life and fish. That is, also, of course, also a social cost for it's a source of protein for the local community. But it is also, for example, there was also a loss of habitat for local species, animal species that were extinguished. Local fish and also, for example, the river otter was extinguished in the process of river industrialization. And so what I suggest is also that if we want to build a new idea of the common, we have to find a way of including the natural world and the living world into our consideration. The second point, place and agency. Here, I'm not totally agreed with you, because in history we have an idea of agency that is very structured, very specific about humans, about human will, about mental capacities. And of course, applying this to a place, it is correct, of course, as you point out, if we see a place as the product, the result of people's work and people's lives in that place. But again, as in the first point, I wanted to suggest that place is always is also something that has to do with the non-human world. So the non-human world, the living world, and the physical world that does not have agency. I mean, not at least not in the conventional. We can discuss about that, of course.
But if you think like agency is a very individualistic idea, then, because you say
no, not.
Because if a human community lives in a place, is shaped by that place,
right?
It's the voice of that place. I mean, clearly it's the voice of that place. The voice of the Susa Valle is the community of the Susa Valle that struggles against the train. And clearly those people struggle and develop the voice of the place by being in the place. To me, is kind of, of course animals don't speak and don't have like a voice. However, in a relational perspective, they do determine the way in which the people of that place speak, not as individuals, but as a polity, as a community.
No, I agree with that.
Okay.
I agree with that.
So
it's just that this word agency is a bit too controversial in the social sciences, in the political sciences. That's why, I mean, there's also a debate within environmental history if nature has agency, in what terms we can talk about nature's agency, for example, climate.
Yeah, but it is crucial legally, you see, because if you say that nature doesn't have agency, then you kind of poke fun on attempts to constitutionalize nature's rights, like in Ecuador and places like that.
Right.
So you do not deconstitutionalize the right of something that doesn't have agency, because rights are something that come with agency as the way to enforce them. So it seems to me that it's something that requires some attention and some. It might well be a controlling process of a certain theory to say, well, you unite agency and you individualize agency.
Yeah.
And then you,
in that sense, I agree.
And then you create the law in a position that is only focused on the individual.
I agree with you. That's a good point. I mean, in this new idea of the commons, we should include a new idea of agency, which might be collective much more and socio-ecological much more than individual and simply social.
Okay, good. Thanks.
Yes, hi. I really liked the presentation. It was really interesting. I had a couple of questions. Firstly, on the water-land dichotomy, would it be fair to say that because water doesn't acknowledge national sovereignty as much as land does, that's a major reason as to why they're fundamentally different? And the water wars thing that's been coming out a lot in this century, would you say that's a fair dichotomy to draw between the two?
Well, no. Sorry, because actually also land is very remittent to national boundaries in a different way than water. But again, if we take a vision, a different vision of land than those we are used to, we see that land cannot be really distinguished by its people, and frontier border people are usually the best manifestation of how national borders, either a state or colonial or post-colonial, are usually very wrongly conceived. So I wouldn't see there's a lot of conflicts about access to land in border areas. So I don't really see a difference. And what I mean, if we want to draw a difference, it's not between land and water, but I mean, we could think that the superimposition of the national boundary is one more element of contradiction against the logic of flowing and the flowing water. And this, of course, has consequences because, for example, development projects that happen upstream in a country can affect, environmentally affect downstream countries, and this happens a lot. I mean, the best example is the Aswan Dam and in Egypt, but there's so many cases in which this happens. So again, but it's not like I wouldn't emphasize this as a difference with land, because land can be also very controversial.
I guess my distinction is more because of the breadth. Like you can maybe restrict land, maybe national boundaries, the border territories are more controversial. But when you have the Nile, for example, the length of Africa, half the length of Africa, and you have the countries downstream and upstream and very far apart, and it's a multi-country conflict in that sense. And my second question was, this was a specific example about a river water valley and its enclosure. But is enclosure always a bad idea? I mean, I don't have an opinion on that. That's the question. Because in cases of floods, for example, or water management, not even big dams, like small dams, is enclosure always a bad thing?
Well, dams have been used a lot as a flood control mechanism. Okay, so most of the dams we have today were born. Of course, many more are being built every day in the world, but most of the dams were built in a period when water engineering was very strongly convinced that dams could be a successful strategy against flooding, dams were seen as a way to regiment the river course. But what happened was that after a while, it came out that that was wrong. So, because regimenting rivers, like for example, straightening river course, which is of course important to build dams and to build reservoirs, etc. There is a reason why the rivers have a meandering course, and it must be like that. And the alluvial plain should be left it should be left free in a way to have its own agency and rework itself through the land. And at the moment when you want to re-engineer all of that, there's unexpected consequences that actually have increased in some cases the impact, the risk of flooding. Or in the case of dams have a lot they have a number of environmental impacts. So they might prevent in some way, flooding, but for example, they are subject to accidents, and there's so many cases. There's a wonderful book called Silenced Rivers, which tells the story of all the environmental impacts and accidents and tragedies occurred to this re-engineered rivers and dams all over the world. And it's stories that we don't normally hear because they, of course, go against the water development idea, politics. So.
In some sense, this brings us back to this whole debate between anthropocentric development and conservation-centric development. Because, I'm an Indian, and in India, floods are a huge issue.
Yeah.
We have highly populated alluvial plains, and floods lead to thousands of lives being lost.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering what the alternative is, because big dams are clearly not the answer, but maybe smaller dams, maybe, I don't know, because...
Yeah. We should talk with a hydraulic engineer, with an advanced, socially advanced.
But it seems to me that when she's challenging enclosure, though, she's not really. She's basically saying that mechanisms of concentration and appropriation and taking away something from the commons, like privatizing in the sense of taking off, don't work, and I think should be prepared to say they don't work all the time, because it's rather something that has to be worked out within an inclusive, quote-unquote, democratic platform, the way in which we handle those issues.
True.
So I don't know whether what you were saying, what would be a system of enclosures, would be a system. You say a system of dams, of smaller dams. So that is the use of technology to correct aspects of nature that do encroach in the possibility of anthropization of a given area, because the easiest solution would be just don't go and live there. There are areas in which probably it's very dangerous to live and very bad to live, and just because humans are overcrowded, there are too many humans, we have to go and live there. But nature per se would be just stay off. The floatings have their own logic. That is, has to do with trees or whatever, mangrove. I don't know. There must be some. So the problem is, there is a limited space. We have to live in places in which, and so how much technology can help in that perspective would be more of your question. It's little to do with enclosure, more to do with how and if you should use technology for those things, right?
No, it's a bit of both actually, because saying that people shouldn't live in flood-prone areas is an a priori solution. We already have
I know,
of course.
So in that sense, we have to work with what we've got in some sense. So an enclosure, it's used for industrialization, yes. It's also used for agriculture. I'm not always sure that both are net negative all the time. So I guess that was my larger question. Is it always a bad thing?
Yeah.
Well, I can't give you a definite answer about that, but I can suggest, for example, there's a study on the Rissa Delta that might be of your interest by Rohan de Souza, is his name, he's a scholar from New Delhi, and he details, it's called Drowned and Dammed, and it describes how the delta, it's the colonial watershed I talked about before rapidly. The delta had its own, before the British arrived, there was a way of dealing with the periodic flooding in the delta. There was traditional by local communities. It was controlled, of course, by the local elite, but it was a more resilient. Resilience is one of the concepts that environmental historians draw from the natural sciences that are very useful. It was more resilient because these dams were not permanent. They were rebuilt at every rain season, after every monsoon, so they had this capacity of interacting in an active way with the river, with the ecosystem. And the British superimposed their own mechanical engineering mentality and changed everything, straightened the riverbed and built permanent dams, and that resulted in a very evident increasing of water risk. That's what Rohan tells in the book. I don't know, I've never been there, so but I rely on what he says, and I think it might be a good starting point for your inquiry.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the very interesting presentation and story. From my point of view, that I did not read the book, I would like to know more about the practical differences between the period before enclosure, the water enclosures, and the period after it. For example, if I understood your ideas, your hypothesis was that water enclosures, so the introduction of property rights, private property rights over water, led to negative environmental consequences and social consequences, right?
Yes.
And at the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned the concept of water scarcity and water vulnerability, which are very interesting. And for a presentation, it would be a little bit more interesting if you could present some facts and data about this water scarcity and water vulnerability before and after the industrialization of the valley. But of course, I'm speaking like that because I didn't read the book, and I imagine that in the book you explain.
Yes, in fact. Yeah, no, but thanks for raising
some suggestions, maybe a couple of slides with some facts, because well, I like very much the concept that the introduction of some institutional change may lead to environmental consequences and social consequences in a very clear way.
Yeah, no, but I mean, I take your point. You're right. I should have shown more data, empirical data about this. In the book, I consider more the water vulnerability aspect than the water scarcity, and there's a reason for that. It's because, and it's related to one of my conclusions about a critical view of the community. It's because historically, my point of departure is the feudal society that was there before. Okay? The feudal society was there before the arrival of the French, etc., etc.
So not open access at all. I mean,
not open access, of course, exactly. But senior control, but also regulated in a way that local people could, in fact, access land and water, but at the same time, according to a very strong power structure within the community, within the local community. So, for example, the river was not appropriated, but was controlled de facto by a local class of how could I say that? People who owned mills where they did part of the production process, because there was proto-industry there before. Part of the process was done manually uphill, and part was done at the river. And the people who owned these machines along the river, they were actually those who controlled the river. So, I mean, this community, this feudal system that was there before was, of course, problematic, and was built upon social inequalities and the control over land and territory on the part of the baron, and on the part of this small social class, etc. So it's actually the water vulnerability that is very evident before and after industrialization, because the data I collected about the place before industrialization, flooding is not recorded as a problem of the place. Exactly. On the contrary, it was considered a very healthy place, and people used to go there to enjoy this landscape because it was safe, because all around the river valley is located south of what once were the Pontine marshes, Paludi Pontine. And so a huge wetland area, very unhealthy because for human habitation, of course, with stagnant water and huge malaria problems. And also, south of the Liri Valley, there were other places, for example, the low tract of the Garigliano, which also was wetland area, so not good for human habitation. So the Liri Valley was in the middle, was an uphill place with running water, and didn't have problems of inundation, etc. So this became a recurrent problem every year. At every rainy season, the river overflowed. After the improvement. Exactly. So that was actually, I didn't talk about that, but that was what opened my eyes about these social environmental costs.
Thank you.
I really like the presentation. Thank you for that. So, you described the process of enclosure in the Napoleonic, after the introduction of the Napoleonic Code, and so after the statement of water as a public. So the process of enclosure, as you described, is more of a de facto appropriation from private individuals. Yes. And so it's not a state-sanctioned allocation of property rights. So how did these two things go together? How could you, for example, speak more about the water litigation and how the conflicts were solved? What was the role of the state in that?
Yeah, it's a complicated story that I tell you in one chapter. Try to resume in one chapter, but it's basically it's the way is as you say. The rule of law nominally sanctioned the public character of all water. So that meant that the state did not want to be the arbiter of private litigation. They introduced the idea of the Roman law, the idea that you could use of the water as long as it didn't cause any damage to your neighbors. And of course that never worked out, but the state didn't want to stay out of private litigation, and so this in fact reinforced the idea that rivers were in fact a matter of private law and not public law. So the people who consider themselves the owner of the river, they recurred to the tribunals and against each other, claiming against each other property rights over that tract of the river. So that de facto reinforced this idea that water was something of a private nature more than, and that's a very interesting contradiction between the state law and the practice, the legal practice.
Well, first I would need to thank you for this interesting presentation, and I would like to ask you about the link between the social impact of the social relationship and water scarcity. I mean, the place where I come from, we have a huge problem with water, and I come from Jordan, a small country, a shortage of water everywhere. Then we found ourselves with a huge problem where there was a project running out for almost 20 years to bring the water from the desert into the main cities. And in fact, the government wasn't really able to run this project. Okay? So finally we found ourselves with a Turkish company coming from Turkey to monitor and operate this project, and they will monitor the project for 25 years. So I did not really find a social impact or a social, let's say, reaction regarding this issue, because you see, I mean, talking about the norm of common is something like touched everybody. But at the end of the day, I think, or I assume that the link between water scarcity and the social impact is relatively different in developing countries than developed ones.
Well, that might be. I don't know the situation in Jordan, so I can't give you a detailed answer. But I tend to think that more than developed or not developed, it's more like a context, and the ecological conditions of each place matter more. For example, you are describing a desert environment here. So I assume that has a different impact, because when you talk about, when I talk about water scarcity, I'm talking about water scarcity that's been produced and created where there was none. But you're talking about a context where water is scarce. Okay? So of course it's a different. In your case, it is the state bringing water to the people. So of course, I mean, you have to look at this thing. You can't look at it with the same structure I gave to my book, because you're talking about a different environment. I'm talking about a Mediterranean valley, and you're talking about a desert environment, and I'm talking about a place before industrialization and urbanization and local peasant community. You're talking about a place which is already being urbanized. And people have already been moved from the villages to cities, or there have already been huge changes in society-nature relationships in respect to past societies. So, of course, these things are very context and place relevant. So you will need your own conceptual scheme.
Thank you for your presentation. When you were talking about methodology, you mentioned interviews. So I guess local communities in the Lily Valley were involved in your research?
No, actually not, because I decided to stop at the end of the 19th century, so there were no more living people who could tell the story. And unfortunately, the written sources I found do not give us the voice of the common people of the time, because they were all uneducated. They didn't have access to the production of written documents. So what I do, I use a sort of discourse analysis to deconstruct the written source as a testimony to the vision that the local elite and the state had of the river. So I don't assume theirs as an objective, of course, description, but I cross it with class and power.
That's really ridiculous. Yes, I was thinking that maybe someone born, about the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, no, I didn't find it. But there are cases in which environmental historians do use oral sources. And of course, there are many ways you can use oral sources. You can interview water engineers, for example, hydraulic engineers of a state project, and take their vision as objective and scientific. Or you can deconstruct their vision and confront it with the vision of people who have been affected by the water project, and put the two, maybe using some pragmatic sociology to analyze this confrontation.
Okay, so if there are no more questions, I will close. Thank you very much, Stefania. It was really